Hello, welcome to the Jim RPG show. So Yakuza is my favorite video game series, and the latest game just came out a few days ago. It's called Yakuza Like a Dragon, and I've been playing it the last few days, and we're going to make some content out of it. So we're going to do a PC performance guide to begin with, and that's going to look at a lot of different settings in the game, and that's going to help you pick the right settings to use for your PC. And I'll also be doing an impressions video, so look out for that. I might do 2 impressions videos, seeing as it's quite a long game, and then after that I will do a review. Okay, remember, if you like this video, make sure to click on the like button and also to subscribe to this channel for more gaming videos like this. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is the PC that I used, and that's an i5-4690K, which is overclocked at 4.2 GHz. It has 16 GB of 1600 MHz DDR3. It's a Gigabyte G1 GTX 1070, which runs at stock, or the factory overclock that came out of the box. And I installed this onto a 3TB hard disk drive. I'm also using a 1440p 144Hz monitor. Now in Yakuza I can't actually select 4K, and I can't super sample to 4K. I've actually provided an estimate of 4K results, which is based off the Yakuza Kiwami 2 results, which is fairly similar, so that's just a ballpark figure. If you're running a 4K monitor, that's not the performance that I got, because I didn't actually test 4K. But it should be pretty close to that estimate anyway. Okay, so the first table that we're going to look at is this Yakuza Like a Dragon PC performance table, and it's got the resolutions down the columns and also the quality setting down on the left. Now, there was actually a bug in the game, and if I tried to select the quality setting for ultra or high or medium or low, it doesn't actually do anything. So I actually had to go into the advanced settings and make up my own, I guess, custom presets for ultra and high and medium and lows. And I'm just going to flash these up onto the screen right now so you can understand what I selected for ultra and what I selected for high and medium and low. But essentially for ultra, I left the multi-sampling on. In high, I turned that off, but kept everything else high. Medium, I just used all medium stuff, and low, I turned everything off. Now, I also performed these tests with Ichiban on Tenkaichi Street, which is one of the most heavily performance-intensive scenes in the game because of the long draw distance, and also there's just so much stuff going on. There's lots of people around. There's lots of smoke effects. There's real-time reflections on the ground. There's lots of lighting, and it's pretty intensive. You can tell because if you just turn 90 degrees and stare at a wall, then the frame rate just goes way up. And another place you could do these tests is around Theatre Square, because it's such a large area there. There's lots of people running around. But if you did it in a dark alley, then it's not really going to be representative of the game. Okay, so if we look at the 1440p results, for ultra we got 38 frames per second, for high with the multi-sampling off we got 44, medium we got 47, and if you turn everything off with low you get 60 frames per second. Now 1080p was interesting because 1080p is 2 megapixels of rendering and 1440p is 3.7 megapixels. So you would expect almost double the performance, but actually what we see here is it's just about 50% performance, and that might be because there's a CPU bottleneck. So if we look at the CPU performance chart here, it's already at 100% at 1080p. Now the GPU is also running at 100%, so the CPU might not be completely bottlenecking it, but it's running it very close, and I think that's why we're seeing just a 50% improvement rather than 100% improvement in 1080p. And I've also got the results here for 720p and 600p, and as you can see for these, it's definitely CPU bottlenecked because it can't go any higher than the 76 or 85 frames per second in 720p, and the same again in 600p. Technically, you would expect the performance to improve jumping from 720p to 600p, but it's CPU bottleneck, so the CPU can't pump out the frames any faster. Okay, so let's take a look at the individual settings. So we need to go into the advanced settings for this, and then we'll go through each individual setting and go through what each one does and how much of an effect that you're actually going to get from going through the different levels of quality. Now for this test, I turned everything to the ultra setting, so everything is on high and there's multi-sampling on. And then what I did was I turned each setting down a notch to see what the difference was going to be. So you can see here with the texture detail, you don't get very much back if you go from high texture detail to low texture detail. So you only get an extra 2 frames per second, so that's probably like about 5% extra performance. And that 5% extra performance isn't really worth it, where you see how atrocious the low setting is. Medium is okay, but it's still quite blurry, so I would say that most people should stick to high texture detail. Texture filtering is basically the anisotropic filtering of this game, and what that does is if you didn't have this turned on, then textures would look quite blurry in the distance. But this setting is not very performance intensive, so you can leave this on quite high and it won't make any difference to your frame rate. So Shadows was a really interesting one. I expected a bit of a performance drop in Shadows because normally that is what happens. But in this game, there was only a 2 frames per second drop between high and low. And maybe that's to do with the fact that it was at nighttime, and I probably should test this out in daytime again. But I think in general, for me anyway, I don't really mind too much if the shadows are medium or high. Some people are more picky about this type of thing, but for me, I would probably just leave it at medium. With the geometry setting, at high, it's at 38 frames per second, but at medium and low, it's at 41 frames per second. And I only see the tiniest of difference between medium and high, so I suppose you could probably drop it down to medium if you don't mind too much, but if you're really picky, then I would keep this on at high. Okay, so the next setting is real-time reflections, and this was a really tricky one for me to decide whether to turn this one on or off, because with it on, the game looks so good with all of the reflections and the puddles on the ground. There is a, I guess, 5% performance difference of having it on or off. So I think if you really like your graphics, then I guess you would turn it on, but if you prefer performance, I would have it off. The next setting is motion blur, and I was actually surprised that this also had a 5% performance penalty, and for me I would turn the motion blur off. I don't really like depth of field and motion blur and anything that kind of makes the games look blurry. So the next one is screen space ambient occlusion. Now if you don't know what that is, in a nutshell it adds in shadows around an object to make it look a bit more realistic. And because in the way that the lighting is set up, it can't always light a scene properly, so that's why we have SSAO. And I think this is a pretty hard setting to assess if you're just walking down Tenkaichi Street. But for me personally, I'm not all that big on shadows anyways, so for me I would just turn it off. The next setting is render scale, and this is basically like setting your screen resolution. So you can see when you adjust this render scale, it does a percentage of the resolution that you're actually in. So here we've got the different percentages of the render scale and the frame rate that it's actually running at. So for 90% of 1440p, it runs at 45 frames per second, and so on and so forth. At 90%, you don't see too much of a difference in the screen resolution, but as you get down to 80, 70, 60%, then it starts to really show. So this is effectively like changing the resolution anyway, so you can change one or the other to get more FPS, but for me personally, I like to keep things sharp, so I like to run it at the monitor resolution. The next setting is anti-aliasing. And you know, this was funny because I turned the anti-aliasing off and it really didn't change the frame rate all that much, because with TAA or temporal anti-aliasing, which is usually the most expensive of the anti-aliasing. There was only a 5% performance difference between TAA and anti-aliasing off. So for me, I would just run it at TAA or FXAA, one of the anti-aliasings. I wouldn't have it off because in this game there's a lot of straight lines and a lot of angled lines. So if you don't have anti-aliasing on, the jaggies are very noticeable in this game. The next setting is depth of field, and I thought this would actually help the resolution if you turn this on, because it would kind of blur everything together, but it actually did nothing for the frame rate. So I guess you can leave it on or off depending on how you like your games to look. And the last setting is multi-sampling. Now I believe this is effectively super sampling, so it's bumping up that resolution to reduce the amount of aliasing in the game. And as you can see there, this is a big performance jump, so it's about 10% of performance. So if you already have an anti-aliasing on and you're happy with how it looks, you can pretty much turn this one off and you'll get a 10% performance boost. So as you can see here, many of these settings give you performance boosts, although some do not. So now that you know which ones do give you performance boosts, you can be more picky about which ones to turn on and which ones to turn off. So for me personally, I like to run my games at the highest resolution or my monitor resolution if I can, and that's at 1440p. The next thing, of course, is that I want to run my games at 60 frames per second. Now, unfortunately, because I have a 1070, it doesn't actually get up to 60 frames per second unless I turn everything off and everything down to low. And I don't really want to do that because it makes the game look incredibly ugly. In the end, I settled for about 52 frames per second, and that meant that I got the game to look how I wanted it to look, but also there were some compromises so that I could get the frame rate as high as I could. So for me to get this to 52 frames per second, I used a high texture detail. I used ×8 texture filtering. For the shadow and geometry, I used medium settings. I turned off the real-time reflections and also the motion blur and SSAO. I left the render scale at 100%, and I also turned the anti-aliasing to FXAA. And for depth of field, I turned that off and I turned multi-sampling off. If you compare that to the 38 frames per second that I would get if I had the game on Ultra, that would be a 36% performance boost going from 38 frames per second to 52 frames per second. And really, the only thing that I regret turning down would be the real-time reflection, because I think that makes the game look really good. But in the long run, I don't think it's going to matter that much, and I'll probably forget about it after a while anyway, so I just decided to turn it off. Okay, so that's the settings guide for Yakuza Like a Dragon, and I hope that helps some of you guys out there. Now, if you have any questions about the game, just drop a comment down below and I'll see if I can answer it. And feel free to leave a comment about how it's performing on your system. I think in general it's performing pretty well. I saw a couple of bugs where textures weren't loading in and buildings weren't loading in, but if we give Sega some time, I'm sure that will be patched out after a while. Okay, so that's it for this one. Make sure to keep an eye out for my Yakuza Like a Dragon impressions of the game, and I'll try and upload that in the next day or so. But for now, if you can subscribe to the channel, that will make sure that you get a notification when that video comes out. Okay, so I'll see you guys in the next one.